Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love. Listeners, we're recording this on winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and it's a beautiful day in Utah. My guest and I are both in Utah, and by the time you listen to this, you'll be on the road to the longest day of the year in June, which is one of my favorite days of the year. But my guest on today's podcast, calling in from his office at Utah State University in Logan, Utah, is my friend Patrick Mason. Welcome to the podcast, Patrick.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
I think a lot of our listeners know you. You have a Wikipedia page. Whenever I have a guest and I go on Wikipedia and the guest is there, I know that I'm interviewing somebody, and all of my guests have an important story to tell, but you're a little more well-known in the Latter-day Saint community. Will you first introduce your education background? I know you've got a couple degrees, master's degrees and a PhD. Just introduce that, and then we're going to talk about the books. We're going to talk about your assignment at Utah State, and then the book we're going to talk about.
Yeah, terrific. So I got my bachelor's degree from BYU in history, and then went on to graduate school at the University of Notre Dame, which was just a terrific experience. And I got a couple of different master's degrees, one in history and one in international peace studies, and then finished my doctoral degree in American history.
And you had twins born in Indiana, I believe, during this time.
Yeah, that was my real education.
Tell our listeners how many kids you had under 3 at Indiana.
So we've got 4 kids, range from 12 years old to down to 4.
So that was crazy times. PhD and twins, and I think you had another little kid during that time too.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, that was the year that we had the twins was the year that I was finishing my first book, and it was. Let's just say that we don't have a lot of memories of that year. My wife and I we're very glad that we did take a few pictures and videos along the way.
That is great. Tell our listeners how you got to Notre Dame.
You know, it was a bit of a fluke, but a providential one. So maybe not a fluke at all. When I graduated from BYU, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. I wanted to be a professor, and so I needed to get a PhD. And I applied to programs all over the country. And I went through BYU very quickly, and probably was not quite ready, frankly, to apply to a lot of graduate programs. And I was applying to a lot of elite programs, and I got turned down by most of them. And I got into Notre Dame, and it had and still has a terrific program in American religious history. I was specifically interested in religion, and so I went there. And I can't imagine a better place for me to have studied, both in terms of the professors and the other graduate students and the overall program, but also there was a group of Latter-day Saint graduate students there. In various programs all across the university. One of my best friends was in the history program with me, or what became, one of my best friends. And actually, my new book, it's dedicated to the Glass Darkleys, which won't mean anything to most people, but for me, there was this group of Latter-day Saint graduate students there at Notre Dame that, we'd get together on Friday or Saturday nights and just talk about everything from football to religion to life to everything. And that remains one of the most important group of people in my entire life.
It's really cool. Talk about what you did at Claremont and then what you're doing at Utah State University for our listeners.
Yeah, I've been really fortunate in terms of my career. And so in 2011, I started work at Claremont Graduate University in a position that's called the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies. There's just a handful of these endowed professorships in Mormon studies around the country, around the world. So the Hunter Chair is one of those, named after, of course, Howard Hunter, who was from Southern California. So it was appropriate to have that position named after him. And that was just a terrific experience for me to be there, to be on the faculty, teaching courses in Mormonism and American religion and other related things, and working with just an incredible group of really bright students there, both LDS and non-LDS. So I spent 8 years there, and then a year and a half ago came up here to Utah State, where there's a similar position. Here it's called the Leonard Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture, named after Leonard Arrington, who was one of the most important and kind of path-breaking historians of Mormonism, who was on the faculty here at Utah State. And so it's sometimes I just kind of pinch myself. I mean, it's a privilege to be able to do what you love and get paid for it. And I'm lucky enough to be in one of those positions.
And I wish our listeners could see Patrick, because you can tell he just loves what he does. It's all over his face, and there's so much energy and light and excitement. Is this a new chair at Utah State, or did it exist before your assignment?
It existed before me. So I'm the second holder of the chair. Phil Barlow, who's one of the best scholars of Mormonism, held this chair for several years before I came. This was actually the first one that was established, the first of these Mormon studies chairs that was established. And so Phil held this position. Now he's down at the Maxwell Institute at BYU. Phil's just a great friend and mentor, and definitely encourage anybody to become familiar with him and his work. And he's also just such a gentle soul and one of the wisest people I've ever met. So these are big shoes to fill here at Utah State. And
that's the same shoes I think you filled at Claremont with Richard Bushman.
I followed Richard Bushman there. So I have a habit of...
Introduce Richard Bushman to our listeners, if anybody doesn't know who he is.
Richard is, there's this generation of scholars who are now in their 70s and 80s, and some have passed away, who revolutionized the way that we think about Mormon history. Richard is among that group and among the top of that group. He's most famous in Latter-day Saint circles for writing a book called Joseph Smith's Rough Stone Rolling, which is kind of the definitive academic biography of Joseph Smith. But he was a very well-known historian before that. He finished his career teaching at Columbia University in an endowed professorship there. Richard is just a paragon of not only scholarship, but also discipleship. And one of the wisest people you'll ever meet. I oftentimes say that anytime I feel like I have an original thought about Mormonism, I do a little more reading, and I realize Richard was there, 3 or 4 decades before any of the rest of us. And so he's just, he's one of my mentors. And I can't say enough about the impact that Richard has had, not only in my life, but on our entire community.
What a compliment to Richard. And I don't quite remember, I don't know if you remember off the top of your head, maybe I was asking the date of the book, Rough Stone Rolling. I think it's 2007 from just my...
2005, I think. 2005. He published it in conjunction with the 200th anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth.
And talk to our listeners about the focus of this podcast is going to be Patrick's latest book called Restoration, God's Call to the 20th Century World. But talk about your first book for a moment or two. The first one I'm aware of is Planted. I don't know if there's
so I actually have a bunch of other books before that, but they're all academic books that nobody reads. So Planted was the first book of mine that certainly people in the Latter-day Saint community took much notice of, and it was published 5 years ago at the end of 2015, and at the time, so shortly after I went to Claremont and took the Hunter chair. I've always been a very active member of the church and have loved the church and cared about it. And I was invited by a good friend of mine named Tom Griffith. He said, the Bushmans, Richard and Claudia Bushman, and then the Givens, Terrell and Fiona Givens, are going out and starting to give talks to people about the kinds of questions and doubts that people have about the church. In the early 2010s, I think that was really the moment in which we really realized that there were significant numbers of people who were struggling with their faith. Of course, church membership has always been, a leaky bucket. There's always been people coming in and people going out. But there was a particular dynamic here around what we now call faith crisis, around a number of issues that people were facing. And so the Bushmans and the Givenses were going out and giving talks. And so Tom invited me. I was kind of the junior partner for the Bushmans for a couple of these. It's kind of like High Council Sunday, where they bring along a returned missionaries. I mean, that's the way I felt coming along, and speaking with these heroes of mine, Richard and Claudia. so I did a few of those. I did a bunch of firesides. I started getting invited by Stakes and Wards to speak to this, how to deal with difficult questions about church history, especially because of my background as a historian. And it was interesting. In every single one of these events that I did, we always did Q&A at the end. And there was a palpable sense of pain and of confusion and a kind of hunger for like, where do we go, right? I mean, for a kind of perspective of how do you deal with these things honestly, rather than just burying our head in the sand, but also faithfully, right? Is there a way through this stuff to still be an active member of the church and a faithful one, a believing one? And time after time, people would say, where's the book? Where can I read about this? And this was even before Terrell and Fiona had published The Crucible of Doubt. I mean, there was literally nothing in terms of printed form on this kind of stuff. And I kept saying, I don't know, somebody else is going to have to do it. I've got a day job, right? I'm doing other stuff. I was doing this very important academic research that nobody was reading. I'll never forget where I was. I was doing one of these Stake Firesides, and somebody asked that same question that I'd heard many times before, and it just hit me. I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing this book, right? I mean, a kind of moment of realization, a moment of clarity, so I wrote Planted in order to try and provide just my perspective on how do you think. First of all, can we acknowledge that faith crisis is real, right? I think there was still then a lot of denial among active church members that these questions mattered, that they were legitimate, that people weren't just sort of using them as a cover for other kinds of sin, and we still hear that sometimes. So first of all, to kind of give voice to the validity of the questions and doubts and struggles that people have. But then to provide a framework from me as a believing historian, somebody who's dealt with the issues, dealt personally and gone through them, but also come out on the other side, if anything, even more committed to the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ, to try and provide a framework for people to do that. And so insofar as it's helped people, I'm grateful for that.
The book is called Planted: Belief and Belonging in an Age of Doubt. It's at Desert Book. It's at Amazon. It was published in 2015, and I was a YSA bishop during the time this came out and went through a mini faith crisis while being a YSA bishop. And I knew some of the narrative that I'd heard about people like me didn't apply because I was praying and reading and helping people come into Christ and seeing great success. And had this also going on in my life. And I don't know who got me on your book, but this is a personal thank you over this podcast for Patrick giving me the tools that I needed to navigate that. And that book was an answer to prayer for me. And I'm so grateful that book exists. And then it helped me help the YSAs. And it's forever helped me. And one of the parts of that book I can't quite remember the vocabulary used, but you talk about historical stuff that is kind of one bucket of challenging things, and then current issues like LGBTQ of roles of women. Mm-hmm. And you talked about squeezed out to define one and another term for the other. I don't know.
Switched off.
Yeah. Will you just share that resonated with me? Will you just share that with our listeners?
Yeah. And I think I got this terminology from Richard Bushman to prove the earlier point. But switched off is this notion. I mean, that suggests that somebody at one point was switched on. Yeah. Meaning that they were fully invested in the church, either as a lifelong member or as a convert. It really doesn't matter. But these were people who had testimonies that they, oftentimes had served missions, who were active in the church, attended the temple, were endowed, oftentimes held callings, and saw that very much as their life and their identity. But then something happened along the way. Oftentimes it meant encountering information on the internet, especially with some of these kind of historical and doctrinal issues that troubled their understanding of the church. And they might have been their first response might be to kind of dismiss the information as anti-Mormon, garbage or something like that. But then upon doing a little bit more research, they realize, wait a minute, this stuff is real. That what happens is it's the particular, for a lot of people that I talk to, it's the particular issues, whether it be, I don't know, Joseph Smith and Seer Stones, or Joseph Smith's polygamy, or the Book of Abraham questions, or race and the priesthood. I mean, there's about a dozen issues that come up pretty consistently for people. What happens is it erodes. There's a sense of betrayal. Like, why didn't the church tell me any of this? Right? I've given my life to the church. I've given a lot of money to the church. And why didn't anybody tell me this? And there's a sense of betrayal because faith is trust, right? And so there's a loss of trust, and it's that relationship is damaged. So for a lot of people, that's what it means to be kind of switched off. There's just this feeling of oftentimes of abandonment, betrayal, loss, grief, pain, at what they see as a relationship that didn't live up to the terms that they thought it was supposed to. And so then the second is squeezed out. People who, for one reason or another, just feel squeezed out of the church, out of this culture, but also maybe out of the teachings of the church. And oftentimes this is more, maybe less around social and culture, or less around kind of doctrinal and historical issues, and more around social and cultural issues. For instance, women's equality and women's roles within the church. Or for a lot of people of color, especially within the American church, which is overwhelmingly white. Or I think that the number one issue now is LGBTQ issues, not only people who themselves identify as LGBTQ, but allies and friends and family members, and or just people in the general culture, especially younger folks who have been raised, to expect equality and see it in every other part of the culture. And then some of the things they see and hear at church don't match up with that. So they wonder, is there a place for me in this community? And even, is there a place for me in this doctrine? And so they feel squeezed out.
So that was so helpful for me. I just felt like here was somebody in the church that had navigated this, that talked about how to move forward in a faithful way, that was in the church with the testimony talking about it. And you were the first guy that did that. It was so helpful for me. And it's been so helpful for so many that I've interacted with. And I know you've become friends with my brother, Dave. And I just want to make sure our listeners are aware of his book, because it's a close companion book to your book. His book is called Bridges: Ministering to Those Who Question, by my older brother, David Ostler. And just your thoughts on Dave's book.
I think it's tremendous. Like I said, when I wrote Planted, there wasn't very much on the bookshelves. The church had just started publishing the Gospel Topics essays online, and I actually used those a lot in my book. But there really weren't very many resources. If you went to a Deseret Book or something like that, there was not going to be a whole lot to help you. And that was just 5 years ago, right? I mean, this is recent history. And since then, there's just so many more resources, not only in print, but online, like this, like your podcast. And one of the I think your brother's book, Bridges, for me, it was so welcome when I saw it. And we communicated a little bit while he was writing that book. I was so pleased to see it. I think it's terrific, because if Planted, I think it's a pretty decent book. I wrote it. My name's on it.
It's a great book, Patrick.
but it's long on principles and maybe a little short on how-tos. And partly, actually, that was a conscious choice of mine. I mean, the part of me is like, I'm not in a position to tell anybody what to do. But also, to be perfectly honest, I grew up in a church culture where I heard a lot of people telling me what to do. And so I've always been inspired by, Joseph Smith's quote, we teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. And so that was sort of my approach in Planted. It was much more of a principle-based framework. What I love, but the thing is, I think that's helpful for people, but people also need more. People are busy. People live busy lives. People are grasping for especially either when they're in crisis or when people that they love are in crisis. They want some just concrete answers and examples and things like that. And I think this is one of the things that your brother David's book does. Is it not only is great on the principles and the background, and he does. He did so much research in terms of talking to people who had gone through. So it's very data-driven and evidence-driven, and that way, I mean, it's built on people's stories, which is so powerful. Just like your book, Listen, Learn, and Love, the same kind of principle. And then he responds to that by offering, church leaders and parents and others, and also people who are struggling with these questions, some really concrete, practical suggestions of how they might handle these things, some kind of do's and don'ts, and the don'ts are important because a lot of people have been harmed by things they've heard people say or do, oftentimes well-intentioned, but so I always say, like, if there's one book that a bishop or a stake president or a Relief Society president or somebody should have in terms of how to minister to people with questions and doubts and faith crisis, I think it should be Bridges. Just because I think it built on some of this other really good work, but then really responded to people's actual stories.
Well, I'm very kind of you on behalf of my brother and our family for your support of his book. And I agree with you. It's a really good book. And he's a very analytical kind of a research guy. So I think he brings principles and then just like you said, sort of the data and then what to do. And I think these are wonderful companion books. Listeners, Planted and Bridges, they're both available at Deseret Book. I see lots of Facebook posts about how helpful these books are and how much people are yearning for local leaders to read these books. Often there's a feeling that local leaders perhaps need better tools that these books will provide to minister. I know that helped me significantly to read Patrick's book. It gave me a whole series of tools to help the YSAs, and now since that assignment's end, just in the circles I'm in to help people navigate complicated issues, that no training meeting had ever given me some of the tools that Patrick and my brother provided. Let's shift gears a little bit. You've written we're going to talk about this book. So just introduce this book to us, why you wrote it, what's in it. I'll just turn it over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks. So this new book, Restoration, God's Call to a 21st Century World, it was really prompted by a couple of different things. One is that Planted was as useful as it's been for lots of people, and I've been really gratified by the response to it. And I will say, just to your last point there, I can't tell you how many people have told me, I bought a copy for myself and read it, and then I bought a copy for my bishop or my stake president, or like the stake presidency and all of the high council, right?
Exactly.
Those are the ones I like because it sells a lot of books. So really useful, I think, in some ways, but in a lot of ways, like I was just talking about, Planted was a book that was playing defense in some ways. The sort of responding to the crisis and the struggles and doubts of lots of people, and trying to think of a really positive framework and helpful framework to do that. But in a lot of ways, the questions that animate Planted, again, Planted is sort of acting as a response to those kinds of things, and I think that's super important for us to do that kind of work. But I also, we need to, I think, not only provide arguments for why people shouldn't leave the church, to put it negatively, but I think we should also always be providing positive arguments for why they should stay and why the restoration is meaningful in the like now, today. Of course, we know it was meaningful for the pioneers and for, and so, but today, what does it mean for us? And is there a sort of positive articulation of the gospel that we can offer? So that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book. And then, the other thing is, it is responsive to a kind of moment in time. This year we celebrate the 200th anniversary of the first vision. And so, this restoration thing has been going on for 200 years. That's a pretty good track record as religions go. I mean, not as long as the big ones, but most new religious movements disappear within a generation. They don't outlive the founder. And we've got a good track record now. Mormonism is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, folks. And so what I wanted to do in this book was to reflect on, okay, we've got 2 centuries under our belt. Congratulations, pat on our back, right? What do we do now? What does the 3rd century of the Restoration look like? And, one of the things I talk about in the book is that, the Restoration, this is true of any religion, but it always has to speak to the current needs and questions of the present generation. It's not enough that it answered the questions for your grandparents and great-grandparents. It's not enough that it got the pioneers, from Nauvoo to Salt Lake, or from Manchester to Salt Lake. That was great for them. It carried them through and it gave them tremendous purpose and meaning. And but what does it mean for us now? That's the question that I'm really interested in. So every generation has to rediscover the gospel anew. And that's what this book is trying to do. Is to try and breathe life into what does this concept of restoration mean for us now in 2020 as we stand on the precipice of the Restoration's 3rd century. And so that's really what's behind the book is a series of reflections on how we can make this concept of restoration meaningful for us today.
That's cool. As you talk about this book, and listeners, I haven't read the book, that seems very unique to me, Patrick, and very sort of like, okay, I want to hear more. So share more.
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. Okay. So there are a couple of specific questions that I was trying to address in the book. One is that, so the first chapter of the book is called The Fortress Church. And this is based on some experiences that my family and I had. I had a Fulbright in Romania. So in 2015, we spent almost half a year in Romania, which is just an amazing place. So beautiful and so much history. And the great thing about the history there is because it's not like America or Western Europe. Like you can go to castles. There's like no gates. There's no ropes. I mean, like we would take the kids. We'd literally be just climbing on these like 13th century castle walls, right? I mean,
that's cool.
It was so much fun. But one of the places we visited was a little town called Viskri. It's a little village. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And at the center of this village, and this was true in this region, it was this fortress church. It looks like a castle. It's got this wall around it. It's got the parapets with like the narrow little, windows for, to shoot bows and arrows and stuff like this. But it was a church. And during the Middle Ages, I mean, the people of that village and the surrounding areas, when invaders came, they would rush into the church, close the gates, and they would be protected inside the church, right? And now the thing is, I mean, this is a great place to visit. It's beautiful. It's quaint, but nowadays in the 21st century, this place is nothing more than a museum. Time has passed it by. Right. So it fulfilled its function. It was a place of safety and of refuge for these folks from a hostile outside world. But what I say in that chapter is you can't stay in the fortress forever. You can't stay in the fortress church forever. Time will pass you by. And I think that's what we created for much of our history was a fortress church, of course, metaphorically. And look, I understand. I've written about the violence against Mormons, the very real persecution that our people received, especially in the 19th century. There is a time to circle the wagons, right? There is a time, to flee to Zion for safety. But also, it seems to me that when I read the New Testament, when I read the words of Jesus, what does he call us to do? He calls us to go out and to transform the world. And you can't do that from within the walls of the fortress church. So yes, there is a time to retreat into the fortress for safety. But I think now maybe it's time. I wonder if it's time for us to lower the drawbridge, open the windows, and to go out into the world a little bit more, to meet the people, to meet the world where it is. There's this famous verse, maybe the most famous verse in the New Testament, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. God so loved the world. He doesn't hate the world, right? We use the term the world, and I know that sometimes in the scriptures it is used in that kind of way, but we use the term the world like it's a bad thing.
Right.
But God loves the world.
Right.
He loves it so much, he sent his son. This is what we celebrate this time of year, that God loves this world so much that he came into it through the incarnation to redeem the world. And that's what he calls us to do too. All of the metaphors that Jesus uses, light, yeast, salt, that's what he calls his disciples to be. Now, they're all very, very small. This is the other thing. Sometimes we think, oh, the stone cut out of the mountains, we're going to be huge. It's going to be this big empire, right? We're going to have all these members. No, light, yeast, and salt are all tiny. They are all tiny. But what they do is they have a transformative effect on the larger mass around them. It only takes a little bit of yeast to make the dough rise. It only makes the light particles are so tiny they're invisible, but they dispel the darkness. Salt, you only want a pinch, and it completely transforms a dish. These are the metaphors that Jesus chose to describe his disciples. So our church is never going to be the biggest. It's not called to be the biggest. Nephi saw that. He prophesied that it wasn't going to be the biggest. But it's going to have, what we are called to do is to have a transformative effect on the world. And we can't do that from within the Fortress Church. So that's part of that's sort of what I'm trying to think about here, is what effect, how do we go about? And it seems to me that the mission of the Restoration is not just to get a bunch of converts and bring them into the Fortress Church. The mission of the Restoration is to heal the world. The mission of the Restoration is to unite and heal God's family. The only way we can do that is if we love the world the same way that God loves the world.
Wow. I'm just really moved by that. I think our listeners are too. I think we're all really wounded, Patrick. I think the world is really wounded. I am 60 years old and had a pretty non-wounding life, but the truth is I'm pretty wounded after 60 years. And I think the world is that way, and I'm certainly aware of that more than ever right now. And I look at this, I look at our beautiful restored doctrine, and I look at missionary work, and to me, the Restoration is a means to heal the world and to heal our woundedness, and that's one of, just talk more about, as we leave the Fortress Church, and maybe these are other chapters of your book, what, and I'm thinking of millennials and Gen Zs that are wired exactly the way you're talking.
Yeah.
They don't, I still want them to read your book, but it's like they didn't need to read your book to know what to do this. They somehow just read the scriptures, read the New Testament, look at the life of Christ, and just are wired this way. We've got 6 of those at our home, Gen Zs and millennials, and that's the way they're wired. So talk more just how you do that.
So kind of 2 things here. So I think that there's 2 questions of how does the Restoration speak to this? And then I think it raises the very important question that is implied in your comment of, okay, so if people are already wired this way, first of all, why bother to write the book? But even more significantly, why bother connect to the church? Yeah. Right? What does the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have to offer this project? So first of all, this sense of restoration and a broader sense of restoration. I was raised in the church with thinking that restoration, capital R restoration, meant the church, priesthood authority, the organization of the church. And I still think there's a lot to that. But something really interesting happened while I was writing this book. I did a little bit of research. This is not a history book. But I'm a historian, so I can't help it. So I have to look into history a little bit. So I was doing some research on, okay, how did Joseph Smith talk about the Restoration? I'm used to using these phrases, the restored church and the restored gospel. So I went into the Joseph Smith papers, which is terrific. You can just go on the website and search everything that Joseph Smith ever said. And so I entered the term restored church. You know how many times Joseph Smith referred to the restored church, like that actual phrase, restored church?
How many?
0.
Wow.
Joseph Smith never used the phrase restored church. Never. Not once. The first time the phrase restored church appears in General Conference, 1918.
Wow.
Now, of course, the concept of the restoration of the church was there, but people didn't talk about the restored church. And, this is just part of my religious vocabulary, restored church, right? But this is new. This is a 20th and 21st century phenomenon. Joseph Smith, in fact, when you think about the Articles of Faith, he does use the word restoration. It's not in the Article of Faith about the organization of the church. It's in the Article of Faith about Israel. When Joseph Smith was talking about restoration, what he was talking about was Israel, and then specifically in the Book of Mormon, and in some sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lamanites. When he said restoration, that's what he meant. Now, for me, I'm a Gen X guy, and late 20th, 21st century. Like restoration of Israel, when I read those passages in the Book of Mormon, frankly, they've never done a whole lot for me. Right. But President Nelson comes along and talks a lot about this, talks about the gathering of Israel, says it's one of the most important things that's happening in the world right now. And so it forced me to go back and sort of rethink this. And again, to think that whenever Joseph Smith was talking about the restoration, most of the time he was talking about Israel and the Lamanites. Well, I think nowadays we're not as confident as we used to be about who and where the 10 tribes of Israel are. All right. We used to have very specific theories about that. I don't think we do anymore.
Agreed.
We used to feel like we had a lot of confidence about who the Lamanites are today. We're not as confident about that anymore. Agreed. Right. So to me, I'm perfectly willing to let God do the work of restoring the 10 tribes, whoever and wherever they are. The Lamanites, whoever and wherever they are, I'm more than happy to let God do that work in his own way. In the meantime, what do Israel and the Lamanites have in common? Well, they have in common a history of being persecuted, of being marginalized, of being scattered. The Lamanites regarded as filthy, right? And it seems to me that we do have a lot of people around us who feel marginalized, who feel scattered, who feel persecuted, who are treated by one group or another, by the majority culture, as filthy. And it seems to me that when God calls us to the work of the restoration in the 21st century, I mean, who does God restore? Who does God minister to? We believe in a God who ministers to the marginalized. That is what God has always done. When he called Israel, that's what he was calling a nation of slaves. He was liberating a nation of slaves. When Jesus came to Palestine, he came into a colonized, oppressed people, and he ministered to them. This has been the pattern of God's work throughout history. And so the restoration means specifically God is trying to heal his family from the brokenness, from the woundedness, from the marginalization, from the fracture, from the violence and victimization that people experience. So what do we need to restore? When we look around, who do we need to restore? Who do we need to minister to? Well, it's the people who are on the margins. It's the people who have been victims of abuse. It's the people who have experienced trauma of all kinds. It's the people who feel squeezed out, who feel like there isn't a place for them in God's family. Because guess what? There's a place for everybody in God's family. This is what God calls us to restore. When he says restoring Israel, restoring the Lamanites, again, there's a very specific set of histories there that I believe in God's promises to do that. But as part of a general calling, God invites us to do his work the same way that Jesus always did, with a special attention. Of course, Jesus's work is to redeem everybody, but with a special attention on those who are marginalized and feel like they aren't part, who for whatever reason, and oftentimes through our own fault, aren't fully experiencing God's love. And so the restoration is to bring people back into the circle of God's love.
That deeply resonates with me. And I look at my baptism covenants, my temple covenants, and to me, it's all about my relationship with other people And
Yeah.
it starts with those that are the most marginalized and helping them feel fully included. And Alma's baptism invitation that you know and our listeners know, I think it's Mosiah 18. He talks first about bear more and comfort. When he
Yeah.
issues that baptism challenge, he doesn't talk about commandments. That comes. But I just think so much of what you're teaching is consistent with what Christ wants us to do and what he taught to do. And I think, Patrick, what we're naturally wired to do, I think somehow the Fortress Church has muted us a little bit from doing what we want to do because we're not quite sure how to reach out to marginalized groups. And we haven't maybe been taught that, even though I think naturally we want to do that. But sometimes we feel like to fully love and follow God, we need to stop loving some of his children. That's a false dichotomy I think sometimes gets set up in our minds. More just examples of marginalized groups and what we can do. Or and I wrote down the name Darren Perry that I think you know. You could talk about Darren. He's actually, we were missionary companions.
Really? Yeah.
And I know that that's an example of, I know you're friends with Darren and are sensitive to the work he's doing. I don't know if you want to talk about that example or just any examples.
Well, I think it's a great example. Again, right? I mean, what relationship do the Native Americans today have to Lamanites? Well, I'll leave that to smarter people to figure that out. But what I do know is that the history of indigenous communities in this country and around the world has been one in recent centuries of victimization and marginalization, exploitation, colonization, displacement, all of those kinds of things, which certainly resonate with the experience of the Lamanites and of Israel in the scriptures. And I mean, what I love about Darren's work is that he's so attentive to the history and to talking very honestly and actually recovering the factual, honest history of what happened to his people, the brutal violence and displacement against his people. That, if not always done directly by Latter-day Saints in this region, was done with their knowledge, and they cheered it on, right. Even when the U.S. Army or somebody did it. But what Darren does is he's interested primarily in a work of reconciliation, which includes a very straightforward and honest accounting of the past. You can't have reconciliation if you paper over the past, if you paper over the problems. That's just a kind of conflict avoidance. And so you have to deal with the problems. You have to listen to the stories of those who have been, you have to privilege the stories of those who have been traumatized and hurt, whether past or present. And that lays the kind of groundwork for future work. One of my in one of my classes, we just read a book by a guy named Charles Marsh. It's called God's Long Summer. It's about religion and the civil rights movement, especially in 1963 Mississippi. It's terrific. It's one of my favorite books. But he talks about the concept of clear burning. This is what a lot of farmers do in the wintertime. He says down in Mississippi is they'll sort of burn their fields, they'll burn their crops so they can see what sort of garbage and litter is laying around, so that they can get the garbage out and then plant the field anew. And he says that sometimes history has to be a work of clear burning, that we have to sort of be able to what seems like a destructive process, this kind of process of fire. But it can reveal what's the clutter and the garbage and the other things in the fields that we need to clear out before we can have a productive season of planting. And it seems to me that in our church, even with only 200 years of history, we have some clear burning to do. So one of the chapters in my book is called Excess Baggage. And I think about, we live in a post 9/11 world. That, whenever you go to the airport, I haven't been to the airport in a long time, since March, most of us haven't. But when you go to the airport, you hear these announcements, don't pick up anybody else's baggage and don't accept packages, don't accept anything from anybody else. Well, it seems that along the way in the restoration in our 200-year history, we've picked up some other people's baggage. We've picked up things that weren't necessarily there or meant to be there in the beginning. but that we've picked up along the way and even taken home with us. And that includes racism, it includes patriarchy, it includes homophobia, it includes, some of these other cultural colonialism, a kind of fundamentalism. So I talk in that chapter about this baggage that we've picked up along the way, that if we want to move forward, if we want the third century of the restoration to be what I think God calls us to be and to do, that we've got to take stock of this extra baggage that we brought home with us, that somebody else gave us, but that we picked up, we brought home. So now we got to figure out what to do with it, and I'd suggest that maybe we need to discard some of that excess baggage so that we can lighten our load and move forward in a productive way.
I love that, and I've never mentioned my other brother's book ever on this podcast. I have a brother that's a history professor at the University of Oregon, and he wrote a book, listeners, called Surviving Genocide: Native Americans in the United States from the American Revolution to Bleeding Kansas. And that's a book that came out in June of 2019. And that really takes everything up from the United States from the 1750s to the start of the Civil War. And he's working on the second book, which is everything since then, and mostly history of the Western United States. And I love some of the things you said in that segment. You can't gloss over. You've got to fully reconcile the past, and what Darren's doing and others are doing with him is the path to healing, and you can't gloss over. So I encourage, it's great work that Darren's doing. We never talked about this when we were mission companions in England. But it's just fun to see what Darren's doing, and that you two have joined forces in some ways in helping make this happen.
Well, that's one of the things. I mean, it's interesting you guys never talked about it. I mean, and when I talk to people from minority communities and marginalized communities, that's oftentimes their reality is they feel like they can't talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. They have to bury it. They have to sublimate it. And so I think sometimes those of us who are in majority cultures or in positions of power and privilege, we need to actively create spaces for people to tell their stories and share their pain, because the dominant tendency is to ask people to bury that, to squelch it, to not rock the boat.
Do you talk about women or LGBTQ in your book? Some of the other just share LGBTQ thoughts for our listeners and women thoughts.
Yeah, and I have to say that in this book, I don't spend a ton of time talking about LGBTQ issues. I mention them as part of this broader set of issues that we have to deal with, but I don't dive in any detail. But I think right now in 2020, and who knows what it's going to look like 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now. But in some ways, that doesn't matter, right? What we're asked to do is to deal with what's right in front of us. And what's right in front of us right now as a church is to figure out a better way to include, to value, to provide opportunities for full participation for all of the members of the body of Christ, all of its members. Because we know this from Paul, that every part of the body of Christ matters. You can't say to one part of the body, you don't matter very much, or you're insignificant, right? We have no need of you, I think is the line that Paul uses. In fact, Paul inverts it the way that the gospel always does. The gospel always turns our expectations on their head. And Paul says, we give greater honor to the lesser members, or those members that are perceived to be lesser, right? That don't have a place of honor. And he says, we give greater honor to those. And I think that's one of our challenges right now. And I don't know, it's not my prerogative, it's not my position to know what the church is going to do in terms of a formal policy-driven way, for women or for LGBTQ members. But what I do know is, again, what's right in front of me, which is the ways that each of us, because when people ask me about these things, they're always asking about what's going to happen in Salt Lake, and all that kind of stuff. I'm very interested in that, but I have absolutely no control over that. None whatsoever, right? All I can do is be a Christian. all I can do is within my sphere of influence, whatever that is, whether it be on podcasts or in writings, or most of all in my local community, in my ward, and among the people that I am among, is to create spaces of inclusion, to broaden the body of Christ, to give honor to every member of the body of Christ, and to seek their gifts and to allow them to flourish and bring all of their gifts to the table. That's what I can do, and to plead for greater inclusion, to remind us of the fundamental doctrine, the most important doctrine of all, is that every single one of us is a child of God, made in the image of our Heavenly Mother and Father. That is the most important thing. And everything else has to stem from that. If we start from any assumption other than that, we've started on the wrong foot. And so that's what I can do, and that's what I try to remind people to do, is that you have the power in your local sphere, whatever it is, within your family, your ward, whatever your sphere of influence is, to create greater spaces of inclusion for women, to create greater spaces of inclusion for LGBTQ members, for people of color within the church, for anyone who has not traditionally found themselves in places of honor within the church, which would basically be anybody except for fairly well-off heterosexual white men like myself. And so I again, the kinds of policy things the church has to do, that's not what God has called me to do right now, but he has called me to be a Christian. And I can never stop doing that.
It's a great answer. What do you say to people who hope our policies change and our doctrine changes, and they sustain current doctrine and current policy, but they really fundamentally at their core, if they're LGBTQ or allies, hope policies or doctrine change? Does that disqualify you from being a faithful Latter-day Saint?
No, it never does. It never does. In fact, we always, part of what it means to be a Christian, part of what it means to participate in the restoration, is to hope for better things. And hope is a very powerful Christian virtue. And it's not a passive virtue, it's an active virtue, the same way that faith and love are. And we always have the power of prayer. And I think we have to believe that our prayers are efficacious, and that our prayers are heard in heaven. I think we are each called to be anxiously engaged. And mostly that happens for most of us at a local level. And so, I mean, one of the reasons I love books, like one of my favorite church books is Nylan McBain's book, Women at Church, where she has a lot of questions, but she also says, working within the current structures that we have, what can we do? And what she calls us toward, in the spirit of being anxiously engaged, is a spirit of creativity and innovation, right? That the way we've always done things is not the way the things have to be done. And that there's actually a tremendous amount of latitude and flexibility and creativity that we can bring into our local practices. If we will open our eyes, if we'll be attentive, if we'll seek inspiration, God will inspire us to do his work of restoration within our sphere of influence. And I think, look, I mean, you know as well or better than anybody, but I've talked to a lot of folks too, that there's just a lot of pain out there, and that's what breaks my heart. And I hope that for me, some of the greatest stories of courage and faith are the people who remain committed to institutions, including the church, even when the institutions have not always been fully committed to them.
What a great statement.
And because they feel called to those places. And I just so deeply respect, and not everybody's going to feel that. Some people are going to experience our community as a place of hurt and trauma and pain. And it's hard for me to argue somebody that they should stay in in a place that only causes them pain. But if they are able to find redemption, if they're able to be agents of redemption, if they're able to co-participate with Christ in the redemption of the world, which includes the redemption of the church, then I think that's a holy calling. And some of the holiest people that I've met in this life are the people for whom faith is not an easy thing, and participation is not an easy thing, and they haven't always been welcomed. I mean, for me, like, being a member of the church is, sure, I have my little speed bumps, but that's all they are. I mean, the church was built for people like me. It was created by and for and of people like me.
Same.
And it works really well for me. But my calling is to make it work well for other people. And because that, I think that's what God wants. I'm pretty sure that's what God wants. In fact, I know that's what God wants. And so I just honor the holiness of the lives of people whose faith and commitment is refined in struggle and perseverance in a way that I'll just never personally experience.
It's a great segment. I love your answer to that. It came very quickly to you. You've obviously thought of that question before, Patrick, and it was just the answer was just born out of creating space for people and love and understanding and empathy. And I don't want, our church to play small ball, is what I call it, is everybody has to have uniform beliefs about where we should go with potential future policy or doctrine as a way to sift people out. We just get smaller and smaller. And let's create spaces. We're creating Zion for people that are willing to follow the church and support the institution, support our doctrine, but hope and pray that something changes, and recognize they feel, even though they don't have stewardship for the whole church or know God's will, their personal feeling and their lived experience is that we're not to the finish line with helping women feel fully valued, and maybe more importantly, using their gifts to help us become the body of Christ. And same with our LGBTQ members and other marginalized groups. So,
well, and especially with women, I mean, LGBTQ issues, I think, are the hardest because it's so new for all of us, right? I mean, sometimes we forget that it was only halfway through his administration that President Obama got fully on board, right?
True.
With, same-sex marriage and other things. So this is, look, if you're somebody in Gen Z, this is the world you grew up with. But anybody older than that, it has to recognize that there is no issue. And I say this now as a historian. I mean, I've thought about this a lot. I cannot think of a major social issue where there has been a more radical and dramatic change in such a short amount of time in the history of the world. And I don't make those kinds of statements lightly. Think about women's rights, think about abolition, slavery, civil rights, and so forth. That took decades, centuries, right? A long time. And I know there was, a long prehistory for LGBTQ, the struggle for gay rights and LGBTQ equality. But the real movement doesn't begin until the second half of the 20th century and mostly in this century, right? I mean, it's a blink of an eye historically. Wow. And I think a lot of us and institutions, including our governmental institutions, are still trying to figure that out. But with women's issues, there's such, we've been wrestling with this for a very long time. And in our church, we actually have a history of dramatic and radical possibility of something like equality. With the founding of the Relief Society and with temple ordinances and things like this. In a lot of ways, the 19th century church was far more radical on gender issues. And I'm not talking about polygamy. I'm talking about men and women and the empowerment of women than we are now. We actually retrenched in the 20th century from the position that we were in the 19th century in terms of recognizing and empowering women to exercise their spiritual gifts and leadership. So if we need a restoration, part of our restoration is to go back to the early years of our movement.
That's
when
powerful.
We more fully recognized and appreciated the gifts that women had to bring to the church and to the movement. Even then, we weren't perfect. But in a lot of ways, we were more, quote unquote, progressive. And I don't mean that in a political sense. But we, there was some radical empowerment going on in the 19th century with its limitations that we've forgotten and need to recover and restore.
I love that. And the Givens, they have a new book out. They were on an earlier podcast, and as I've read some of that book, it talks about some of that beautiful, unique restored doctrine of heavenly parents, co-equal, co-creators. We can have a person relationship, the role of Eve and Adam, and that equal role. And I forgot, Patrick, how unique that doctrine is until I read it through the lens of the way they teach it. And that's probably part of your book, is how radical that was to the times of the day. And to me, when people say, I hear people in church say Joseph Smith was a prophet, I kind of now want them to go one or two steps further. What that means is beautiful restored doctrine that came through the restoration that allows these sort of benefits, and I'm a marketing guy, to come into people's lives, like, this relationship we can have with heavenly parents, and understanding of the role of women, which helps me as a man to better understand the role of women. It's not just for women.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the things that has to be restored, one of the things that we have that we've not yet fully developed, is our understanding of Heavenly Mother and of the divine feminine.
Yes.
I think that's part of the 3rd century of restoration. Again, historians make poor prophets. So I don't put any money on anything I ever say in terms of predicting the future. But it seems to me that we are very well positioned to restore more of a doctrine of Heavenly Mother. When I teach students about Mormonism, and I've taught courses on Mormonism and gender for graduate students and others, and I always have non-LDS students, and when they learn about this notion of a Heavenly Mother, like an exalted female, and that all women have the potential to become goddesses, equal in power and authority to God, they're like, why aren't you guys telling anybody that? Like, that is like the best thing we've ever heard from any religion ever. And you guys, are keeping a lid on this? Like, you're scared of your own best stuff? Right? They can't believe it. Right? And
it's like the Jazz not playing Donovan. It's like, they're Rudy Gobert.
You're going to keep your best player on the bench for what exactly? Right? To like protect him, right? Or her, right? It makes no sense to them. And once they said it, I was like, oh, well, you're right. That doesn't make any sense. And for me, it's not only theological, but institutional too. The Relief Society was this radical, when allowed to flourish. It was this incredibly powerful organization in the 19th century for women's empowerment and spiritual gifts and healings and so forth. I've got students here at Utah State who are doing their theses using the local Relief Society minute books from the 19th century, and just discovering incredible stuff about the way the women were talking and ministering to one another and blessing and healing. And, when somebody was sick, it's like, okay, call for the elders, but like really call the sisters, right? Because they're the ones who are really going to, minister with power in this situation. And just powerful stuff that I think we've forgotten and need to remember and restore.
I love that. We're at the end, Patrick. Any final things? I'd love to go for another hour.
Yeah.
Any final things?
I'm sure your listeners wouldn't. So
they might.
Maybe.
Any final things you'd love to share?
No, for me, one of the things we didn't talk about today, but which is really important, is the role of the church in all this. Because I think so. I'll just whet people's appetite for that to go into the book, because we do have this claim that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true. Right? It's the only true and living church upon the face of the earth, section 1. What the heck does that mean in a world where we constitute 0.2% of the world population? What does that mean? So I will leave that tantalizing bit with you for readers to discover my answer to that question. But the thing I'll leave with is that for me, the last chapter of my book is totally positive. There's this great quote that I use from 1845 from this proclamation of the 12 apostles of the churches before they reorganized this first presidency. And they were so audacious then. They sent this proclamation to like all the kings and presidents and everything of the world, right? And they talked about the restoration. They call people to repentance. They use all this very stark language. But I love this line where they say, basically, what is the purpose of the restoration? What's the purpose of all this stuff? And they say it is to renovate the world. To renovate the world. And So I leave readers and want to leave your listeners today with this very positive sense of what are we called to do is to renovate the world. It's not just to grow a church. It is to renovate the world, to heal the world, to restore. Yes, God is worried about your family, but more than that, Heavenly Father and Mother are worried about their family. And their family is everybody. That's what we're called to do, is restore their family to wholeness. And yes, so our nuclear families are part of that. Yes, our church is part of that. Yes, our country is a part of that. All those kinds of, but all of that is, as you said, that's all small ball, right? And it's important. It's really important. It is radically important. You can't restore the whole without restoring the parts, right? And because we are finite mortals, usually all we can do is focus on the parts. So God, in his mercy, has blessed us with the ability to minister just to the parts, right? But never to lose sight of the vision, that we are called to renovate the world. That is audacious. It is bold. It is inspiring, right? For people who are bored at church, I understand why people are bored at church. It's because we collectively have not fully caught vision of what God has called us to do. And there is nothing bolder or more exciting or more challenging or harder or more, the things that will just rip us apart and force us to re-examine everything we think we know, than this mission to follow Jesus in building Zion and renovating the world. So I hope that when people read the book, that they come away with a sense of optimism, a sense of hope, a positive vision of what the restoration can be and do in its third century, and a feeling like attaching themselves to this church, to this story, to this people, to this community can be one of the most meaningful ways for them to renovate the world. And to, in that way, to do the work of restoration along with our heavenly parents.
I'm just deeply moved listening to you, Patrick. Our listeners, the book is Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century World. I wrote down the word hope, listeners, in big capital letters and circled it. And that to me is what Patrick is bringing. He's not making that up. He's connecting us with our beautiful restored doctrine. If we really own that doctrine, believe in that doctrine, then to me, it just fills me with hope. Actually, I thought of being a missionary again.
Yeah.
I thought of actually, this is the kind of message, Patrick, I want to take to the world as a missionary, because it heals the woundedness and the brokenness. And the Book of Mormon is a means to that. And the prophet Joseph Smith is a means, but I don't want to kind of lead with those anymore. I want to lead with their addressing their woundedness and brokenness and how that brings hope. And to me, this is a book and your sort of ministry is a roadmap to help us do that. And I love the visual imagery of the third century and that church, I believe, in Romania, and just the visual imagery of where we need to go. It's powerful. So on behalf of all of our listeners, Patrick Mason, and we really appreciate the work you're doing. And this is Richard Ostler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.